Thanks for jumping in Hyperfish HQ today, Wes. You're in town for meeting a bunch of Microsoft people?
Yeah, so I've been meeting with a couple of the teams in the product group yesterday and today, and then there's a dev event happening for 3 days for us to see some of the next generation of the publishing and some other bits and bobs that Microsoft have been announcing over the last 12 months, you know, the next accrued value for what they do in the dev space. So yeah, it should be good fun.
So for those that don't know you that are tuned in, who is Wesley Hackett?
So I'm an Office Server and Services MVP for about 4.5 years now. I'm also the CTO at a Microsoft partner in the UK called Adin365.
Okay,
so,
hence the accent.
Yeah, hence the accent.
This is a real British accent, unlike the muttered British, Australian, American accent that I've achieved over the years.
This is what you'd sound like if you'd stayed where you grew up.
That's right, in Essex, yeah. Were you born in Essex?
No, I'm Hertfordshire. I'm just over the border.
You're in the posh part.
Yeah, just over the border. Yeah, so we build Office 365 products and around productivity, collaboration, and we have some stuff in publishing and the intranet space as well. So. Okay. Yeah, good fun getting the value out of the Office 365 stack.
And you're similar to what my role used to be when I was in consultancy type world. Like you do development, but we also do a lot of guidance on kind of architecture and getting the most out of now Office 365. But back then it would have been SharePoint and stuff. Yeah.
So I head up the technical half of the business. So I'm responsible for the products implementation, the engineering team, but I also spend a lot of time with our customers directly, working with their enterprise architects, the CIO, the security office, to talk about all the different aspects of Office 365 and how a business can get the return on their investment. You know, so like an E3 is probably 15 to 17 quid a month per person per user. And we want to help those organisations get that return from that invested licence fee. So,
and how have you found the market most of your customers in England, or like how do you find that adoption of the cloud and Office 365 compared to I'm still running Exchange on-prem and I'm running SharePoint on-premises?
We do a lot in the financial services sector in the UK, which is obviously one of the slower to adopt cloud technology sort of areas, because they have a lot of regulatory compliance to deal with and security considerations against some of the other industries which have been early adopters of cloud. But we've been really sort of pushing those pioneering FS customers into Office 365. We've deployed one of the first retail banks in the UK is now in Office 365 and has gone live. And we went with a UK data centre tenancy as well. So a couple of firsts there, first bank, first UK data centre FS customer.
Wow.
It's been a really fun journey with that particular organisation. They're a very pioneering brand, and we've helped them on their journey from everything from understanding what all sort of 17 or so services in Office 365 are and do and can help them achieve, right way through to a technical platform and a product that helps them do that in a safe and controlled manner.
And have you found like their adoption, like a lot of people listening will be concerned around, they've jumped in and they've done email because it seems to be the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
But what do you find is their next nut they want to crack? Because they're paying at a minimum for a certain amount of services in Office 365, and the old days with SharePoint was like the naked cow, where customers would buy SharePoint, but they might not necessarily, all their users might not be using it. So what things do you find people jump on after they've kind of checked the email box with Office 365?
So I think, as you say, most organisations that have already adopted Office 365, they have deployed their mailboxes either in all in or in a hybrid configuration. Often alongside that, they've gone with Skype for Business, and we found that Skype for Business is a huge enabler from a lot of organisations. That idea that you can do IM chat, voice and desktop share, and really connecting dots between elements of the organisation. So if you've got a global business and they've got sort of representation of 100 countries, you've got the time zones to deal with, but being able to get an entire team of, say, service delivery people to have a monthly call on Skype, do that hour all together, video, share presentations has been huge. So it tends to be Exchange, Skype for Business, and then our primary purpose for being is to help the customer then take advantage of the other products. So OneDrive for Business, Skype for Business. There's a huge drive at the moment in many of our customers to get off file shares. Just simple stuff taking them out of legacy, S drives, Z drives, and putting them into a collaborative environment. And with the reboot of the SharePoint interface and all the new teams and groups capabilities that have come along, it's a great time for those customers to sort of uplift from.
And you mean Teams, not as in team sites, but as in Microsoft?
No,
Teams?
I mean Microsoft,
genuinely Teams.
Genuinely Microsoft Teams.
Yep.
I mean it's now. I mean it's always going to throw up some challenges around when do you use Skype for Business versus Teams chat, and there's the ecosystem, if you like, is having a lot of conversation around what to use when, and I tend to not have that conversation with customers. I prefer to have the what are you trying to do, and then pick the things on their behalf to help them do that. And
sure.
It's a 180 to the positioning, and it's kind of landing.
And how are you finding, like, with that adoption of Skype for Business now? Is there been confusions with how Skype for Business maps to, say, Microsoft Teams in terms of part of Skype for Business is that instant messenger aspect, but then Microsoft Teams, I mean, I know they call it high velocity collaboration, but the reality is it's pretty much the same as what you would get if you started dragging and dropping people into a Skype for Business instant chat window.
I think most employees kind of get it. They think of see Teams as a direct response to probably Slack.
Yep.
If we're reading the tea leaves. A lot of organisations, especially in the technical parts of the organisation, have been using Slack for a while.
Right, so they get that instant mapping.
Yeah, they get that instant mapping between, we've got a persistent chat thread. And I think the harder conversation is there's not been a great messaging of where Yammer now fits in the ecosystem.
Yep.
I think personally Yammer's a great tool for large group broadcasts, so it works really well in support of conversation around intranet. It works really well in terms of global groups and communities.
Yeah.
And then, you're bringing in the IM chat in Teams for the more day-to-day, they say high velocity, but for me that means day-to-day. It's the you and I talking while we're trying to build
rather
a
than
proposal
the
or whatever.
scheduled comms that go out.
Yeah.
And then I guess and maybe you've read some of the stuff that we've been writing, but around, the Yammer thing is definitely where does that go now in that time frame of day-to-day, which is a great way of explaining it, and then there might be a monthly newsletter that goes out to the whole company, or a bi-weekly or bi-monthly that goes out to certain divisions of the company. Yeah. Is that email now? Is that does it go to SharePoint Team News, to the divisional site for SharePoint? How are you finding that people are reading the tea leaves, as the Brits would say?
Yeah. Well, again, I think there's lots of different channels, but if you boil it down into a more simplistic view of the world, you have a corporate communication strategy. That's why news hubs and news content exists, right? We as a comms team want to say X, Y, and Z about our strategy. We want to talk about the CEO's vision. We want to do a vlog with him. We want to publish that out. We want to talk about it. If you're publishing it out through SharePoint and then you're talking about it in Yammer, and you've got a sort of sealed ecosystem, you might still do the email, because let's not pretend that email isn't free.
That's where everyone's living.
Yeah, everyone's living, and anyone that's trying to sort of wholesale move their organisation away from email is going to have a hard task. But it's just these technologies are adding other channels to communicate to employees that prefer to use those channels. Yeah. Some people still want to use email, and you've got to respect that decision. With the team news, I know you and I were having a long chat over Twitter the other night.
That was good, yeah.
I know when we, as the MVPs, we're privileged to see some of these developments come in at a really early sort of part of the life cycle, and I remember there was a lot of interesting discussion around what is team news. Is it a replacement for the corporate news portal, or is it something else? And I think for me, team news sits really well when you want to announce new content, or you want to announce content being distributed to a customer or from a customer, the arrival of content to the actual working group. So if you think about an Office 365 group, right? So now we've got the conversations, the distribution list, and we've got that brand new modern SharePoint team site. And Microsoft have taken the pain away of which to use by making them one thing.
Yep.
They've just implemented that idea that in personal collaboration, you and I could be working on a document. I might have it in my OneDrive for Business. Now I can say copy to, and I can move it across to my group.
Right.
when that arrives in the group, what would I normally do? I might send a share email. I might go in and say share, and I might share it with 6 other people in the group.
Yep.
But now what you could actually do is create a context in a news article within that team that says, Wes and Jeremy have been working on this document. We've just uploaded it to the group. This is what you should be using as a reference point for whatever task you're doing. The team will then see that on their phone. They get that personalised news stream on the SharePoint mobile app. And again, it's just another channel of keeping the team abreast of the activities.
I quite like the way you were discussing it. And when we interviewed Mark Cashman for the podcast, he was talking about being more like a beautiful way of doing news. So it's not just like tap, 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 here's this document. Yeah. You could embed the document into the team news. But then you could also say and here's a quick Office 365 video, which you could embed, and here's the slide deck, which you could embed. So the way I talked about it was it's like a superset of a document set, in the sense that you're not just posting news that a document's been put up, but here's all the things that you can add, and make it look like the experience you get when you go to a normal website in the modern web.
Yeah, I think the context is key here. I mean, you just take that document and you send it as an attachment on email. You'd write something about it. And all we're doing is we're changing instead of it being in the body of the email, we're now putting that in the page. We're embedding the document in the page, and it's then broadcast to the team as that news stream. You take that further if you've got a document about a process, you've got a video about showing the process being executed. Why not have a Power BI dashboard about the success of that process being executed, right? So you can actually start really combining that business use case into those modern pages, and it's just called news. And I think if you get beyond the kind of
and that was your tweet, right?
If you get beyond the idiosyncrasy of it being called news and people's immediate reaction of being, it's corporate comms, it's actually just me notifying the team that something
and I think that the danger they have at Microsoft is they have so many different products now that can, if you dumbed it down to describing each one individually, you could almost get them saying exactly the same. Like if SharePoint and Yammer, Microsoft Teams, even Skype for Business were in separate companies and they were a startup marketing to the market, they'd probably all come up with a very similar way of marketing. Because they're at Microsoft and they're not competing, but they're all in this Office 365 space and they're trying to carve out where one ends and where doesn't. The groups or connected groups seems to be the way of ring fencing. Okay, you get all of these when you create a group now. And so I think there's going to be over the next 6 months to a year, what's the scenarios where one fits and when one doesn't to make that happen.
I mean, it's interesting that the community are asking for external access on Microsoft Teams. That's the big next ask. And I think that's right, but for me, there's a lot of compliance and security issues to resolve in Teams. How do you, if you've got integrations like custom tabs, bots, and a whole bunch of other things like that, you're not only exposing your data, interactively to the bot can notice something and invoke itself, right? So if you're talking about financial results and you're talking about it in that team, and the bot goes, I've seen you're talking about this. You go, Clippy experience that we were talking about before we started, right? It's suddenly you've got the potential for data loss, and I think organisations have got to be really careful in terms of their remaining secure and productive while taking advantage of these new investments by Microsoft, because it's too easy to sort of say, we're going to go all into Teams without first appraising. Well,
there's a regulation aspect of it as well. Like we were saying around adding a bot to a channel or talking to a bot directly in Teams is all or nothing. There's no way that we can say, here's a list of the bots you're able to use inside this organisation for Office 365. So if you want to use the bot that we build, it also means they'll be able to add the kayak bot, or which could be, I'm talking to you, you're coming to Seattle, and then suddenly the kayak bot chimes in and goes, hey, we've got a really good flight to Seattle, which, in that case might be okay, but depends what those bots that are being added to those channels are doing with information that they're on. Now, admittedly, they'll only be engaged in the conversation when they're at mentioned, but you've only got to be on a really, really long thread where you've mentioned them somewhere near the top and that thread continues for a few weeks. That bot still has that context of whatever's being discussed.
And these are, like I mentioned, we're doing so much stuff in financial services. These are real blockers for some of those tools being adopted, because you've got to work out where your data is, where it's going via transit. If we're talking in a conversation and we're passing customer information up through the chat and dialogue back end the customer has to be comfortable that that information goes through that platform and back out, right? Even if it's not being stored there, it's still going through the platform.
Right, and then in financial services, you've got that segregation, walled gardens where certain people can't know what other people are doing, and how that's being governed in teams and connected groups and so forth.
Yeah, there's so many different facets of what you've got to look at, and I think the skill is really just taking it right the way back and looking at what the business is trying to do, not re-engineering their day-to-day process, but actually just picking technologies that support them in a more kind of modern way, and building upon that as you go forward. There's that hype cycle. There's always a hype cycle with a new tech. Everybody's like really excited about Teams and not necessarily.
You can see it, like go to the user voice and there's like 1,500, 2,000 votes on a feature. Like that hasn't happened in other Microsoft technologies. So there is definitely a hype curve on it for now.
Yeah, and I'm sure that in a lot of organisations taking that adoption on is a good thing. But you do need to go in with your eyes wide open, and I think it's almost the same as the SharePoint extensions and custom stuff that people build.
Yeah. When
we first got what I'd class as modern Office 365, when it switched from BPOS to being Office 365, and we kind of got SharePoint 2013, and we got the sandbox, and we got the add-in model, as it's now known. It was app model at the time.
Yeah, that's CJ's fault.
Yeah, CJ's fault, totally. You get that Jurassic Park moment where there's just because you could doesn't mean you should.
Right.
You can. There's people already using the SharePoint framework to manipulate the DOM of a team site, just because they can, because it's JavaScript and you've got a DOM.
Mm-hmm.
Should you do that? Should your organisation evaluate the value of making some of those customizations and beyond getting a good usage of the baseline platform?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a believer that the out of the box is pretty damn good these days. So why not get the value out of that first and add real business use cases rather than effectively changing the way it looks because you don't necessarily like the perfect pixels or changing the colors in places, because SharePoint's quite customizable but the other services aren't. You can't go into Delve, you can't rebrand Delve, and that's for me an interesting piece there with the SharePoint framework. Where you're positioning the SharePoint framework as an organization. Are you looking at that as the fourth development model, which is throw your old out and build it all in the new, or are you just looking at it as additive that says, okay, if we want to put something in a group team site now, building up that web part because that's the technology it has to sit on because it's evolved into that sort of SharePoint framework. There's lots of landmines you can step on during that process. You could go all in and then suddenly find that actually Microsoft will release a new extension point that you've basically hacked because you could, and you find yourself in a pretty messy place. I mean, custom actions was a great example where as we transitioned from classic to modern, custom actions broke.
Right.
A lot of people suddenly found JS Link, was preventing them taking on the modern libraries, and as a development team, you've got to keep pace with the best practice advice, and obviously the PMP team and Vesa and those guys do a great job of getting the messages out. But there's not much cleanup, as a dev team, you've got to self-clean.
Keep going back.
Yeah, you've got to go back and go, okay, well, we used to do this, but now the best practice is this other thing, and we've got to rework that parts of the product. So
we'll have a beverage break, because I can see you're drying out and you're I'm going to say hungover, you're jet lagged.
Yeah, jet
and I'm going to have a sip too. So, and also while we're doing that, we're going to check to see if there are any questions as well. I guess the other big thing that, you're talking about the user interface and the whole branding aspect is one concern.
Yeah.
But one thing before we tackle the branding was when you're talking to customers, like we've mentioned the Outlook user interface, we've mentioned Skype for Business, we've mentioned Microsoft Teams, we've mentioned OneDrive, SharePoint, and Yammer as well. Like, they're different places that you can land to collaborate as an individual or in a small team or as a larger part of your organization. How do you see the customers that you work with? Like, do they see this as a natural thing that they just jump in and jump out of different things as they go, or do you feel like that's a bigger concern?
Interesting question. I think the average employee, or certainly in my experience, the average employee isn't as concerned as the branding people about the look.
Yeah.
You know, they're kind of comfortable. I mean, to be blunt, most of them spend their life in Outlook.
Right, which you can't brand.
Yeah, well,
most people stick on the same theme they get when they install it.
Yeah. So most people's experience of Office and their office environment is via their inbox.
Yeah.
Right. So immediately you've got a smaller percentage of people that come out of that inbox experience. But day to day, they're really comfortable with going to lots of different applications. I think you can make that easier because you can obviously do the sign-on activities and make sure that they get authenticated into the platforms quick and easy without necessarily constantly signing in and out. But if it has a kind of, I guess for me, Office 365's got a consistent DNA, if not a consistent UI.
It has now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and the Office Fabric team have done a pretty good job of making SharePoint a lot more consistent. And, you know, the services that are sort of a bit older or a bit newer tend to either be pushing the boundaries or catching up.
Yeah.
But if you looked at it as a whole platform, you can kind of tell it's a suite of applications that have got the same parent.
Yeah.
I think where you get a real jarring experience is often when you get something outside of that Microsoft ecosystem and stick it into it.
Right, which doesn't kind of feel the same as the rest of the DNA.
Yeah. So if that be a customization, so you know somebody's built a bespoke intranet and they've stuck a very highly stylized homepage in, it will look highly stylized and it won't feel part of that platform, and the branding aspects will be what somebody decided was the most important aspect of that implementation rather than the use and the data. So that it'd be a bit like walking out of this room and walking into a day glow yellow corridor, having every other room a pastel shade, right? You'd notice. And it's kind of that, for me, it's that employee experience. It's like, okay, I'm definitely in a different place. That can be desirable, it can be something you want to avoid. And there's lots of other things that you can put into Office 365 that can also implement that kind of experience. There's a lot of products that don't necessarily align well with the direction of travel of Microsoft, because they're not part of the ecosystem, they have their own trajectory. And sometimes they can get quite a big void between the way that they look and the way they function with the interactions and the UX of the actual platform. And you can be emotive about it. You could say, well, we're a better UX team and we can do our own thing, or you can kind of accept that if when you click on a Yammer comments button, we always get a fly out and the Yammer thing's embedded, and that's the Microsoft UX. Right. If you put that everywhere, you haven't got to train people to experiences. Where if you have a different experience, you're going to have to train them. And
they're on a bit of a journey with that. And one of the things we saw with an announcement 2 weeks ago now with people cards.
Yeah.
So when I'm in OneDrive now or a SharePoint document library, if I click on whoever last modified the document, at start with, actually, even if you hover over it, a little people card comes up, which is consistent with what you see in Outlook, what you see in Skype. But then if you click on that people card, on the right-hand side now, you get a bigger people window that takes up about the same as what the new SharePoint site does as well.
Yeah.
And that gives me org chart data and everything else. Now, they're going to start rolling that out across all the products. So if I'm in Yammer and click on a user, that's the same experience. And I think you're right, once that DNA becomes familiar to people and they're used to it, I think there's a level of comfort that people will have across all of the experiences they have in Office 365 that it will start to feel the same. And I'm guessing as long as they give that fabric, as a bit lack of a better word, DNA is another one, to ISVs, so that us as ISVs can use that. We can make our stuff look and feel like their Office 365 experience as well. Yeah, I mean,
you see a big drive in Office add-ins, so Outlook add-ins, Word add-ins, Excel, right? A lot of organisations, ISVs that deliver those particular types of product have wholesale tried to be blended in terms of the look and feel. But they might have their logo on a welcoming experience, but beyond that, it kind of looks like the rest of Office. And I think, personally, that users are more accepting when you see that DNA.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, okay, this is just part of Word. I'll just crack on and use it, and I'll click through.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if you've got a bespoke implementation that's suddenly totally different colour palette,
it takes over.
It takes over. Then the user's looking at that going, well, okay, I'm not sure what a button is anymore, what a label, what the label relates to. Is it the thing above it or below it? So there's a cognitive load that's you've imposed upon that employee.
Right, which can help usage of it's funny, when I was at Microsoft, one of the biggest things when I was pushing add-ins, marketing, add-ins and SharePoint add-ins, was this notion of, like get an Office add-in, and they're really great. Like you demonstrate Find Time, you demonstrate Boomerang, and you demonstrate DocuSign, and it blows people's minds. Yeah. But then the reality sinks in that they're still running Office XP, or they're running Office 2003 or 2007, or I've been to recently, I'm on a Mac and I'm running Office 2011, but fortunately now a lot of those have jumped immediately over to the new Office. And I think there's that same kind of regression out there where we're seeing Hyperfish is there's a lot of customers that are still running SharePoint 2010 on premises or SharePoint 2013 on premises. And for those that are listening, they're still on those systems. You're not the only ones out there doing that. And obviously Microsoft are doing a big push to try and get you to go to Office 365, so you always get the latest and greatest. But it'd be interesting to see like what reasons people have for hanging around on old versions of Office. Is it custom development that kind of has beached you there where you can't move because it's too expensive to rewrite that Office add-in, or maybe it's a SharePoint, like you said, like a SharePoint customization that you're running your business on, but you can't rewrite it to SharePoint Online, and because of whatever reasons. Like it'd be really interesting to see how much customization has impeded your ability to go up to the cloud.
Yeah, I think the things we see is obviously we build add-ins. Ron Sill named the company, right?
Right.
We
add in 365.
We add stuff to 365. There was a lot of resistance about building add-ins. From the community, there was other ways to customize SharePoint. You could still use the PnP provisioning to totally wholesale deploy artifacts into your sites and take over the user experience or add the features that you've got. And I think when the questions came up around, is the SharePoint framework a new model or an existing model or an extension model, it was kind of funny because add-ins still have a really clean purpose in my mind. They are isolation points. Right. So a lot of our stuff uses the Microsoft Graph, and that's got an auth token mechanism that SharePoint doesn't use. So it's a different auth mechanism. But also, if you think about the types of data that it might be connecting to, if you're building something that's against a banking platform, the last thing you want to do is share a context token with the whole page. Right. Because you don't necessarily control the whole page. You could get some kind of malicious scripting in, you could put that web part in a place that you weren't expecting, and suddenly that data's exposed in the wrong way. To other parts of the page. To other parts on the page. Yeah. And I think the app parts, they're a little clunky. Right, you can make them responsive, you can make them load fast. And that's mainly because of the iframe implementation. Yeah, there's an iframe implementation there, which is, a set of protections for you as an ISV that you're delivering capabilities that you can isolate, right? Or you're an internal team that you can deliver a capability you can isolate. It's still really appropriate in some scenarios and some circumstances to have that isolation. And again, you need a strong architectural lead within your business or the partners that you're working with to pick the right framework. Yeah. It's not about saying, okay, SharePoint framework is the latest and greatest, therefore we must go all in. Right. It's about saying, okay, well actually we need to be able to deliver these things securely. This thing has to have isolation, so we'll need the iframe around it. And you can choose to use app parts if you're on a traditional page, or you can implement your own sort of version of that isolation in a SharePoint framework. Yeah. But you've got to be architecturally mature. Yeah. And I think the information that you get working with customers helps drive some of those decision points. So the technology space, I think, is the most complex it could ever be. And the cloud's enabled us to do things that 5 years ago would have been impossible. Right. Right. We can hook up to the bot framework. We can hook up to Azure functions. We can spin up complex business solutions very quickly from an infrastructure point of view. But you still need that architect to sit there and say, this is the right way to do it. The blog post we put out 2 weeks ago now on the SharePoint administrations and what they need to know about the new framework. I wrote down different things around, there are controls in place. So the administrators have to deploy these things. It's not like the site collection admin or the site owner can go and add these new frameworks. And
and then sniff on other web parts that may be on the page. And they are extreme security aspects, like it's not going to be a common thing that customers see. And the notion of it being full trust, as Microsoft talk about it, means that they are aware that this is, a decision point you have to make with the ADIM model.
Yeah.
I guess for me, and I'd be interested in your opinion, is that, the framework from a certain group of developers is that this is JavaScript, it's modern language, and therefore there's going to be more people wanting to write on it than the old ADIM model with .NET framework and so forth.
Yeah.
But I guess my impact is that, the typical enterprise developer that's out there right now is probably still .NET-y if they're on the Microsoft stack, which is what SharePoint person would be.
Yeah.
But then it's also that, like the Stack Overflow questionnaire that came out, is, SharePoint was the most dreaded platform out of all the platforms from a survey of 60,000 users. Now, yes, a lot of those users were Linux developers, but that's really, where the web is, right? So the JavaScript node stack.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting kind of path where they go in terms of, do they satisfy the needs of its existing SharePoint developer base? Or do they try and make it really attractive for the broader web community to come in and try SharePoint again and give it another chance? And that was something I personally struggled with because I was in that marketing role trying to get people to move from the farm solutions and sandbox to add-in. And I just decided that it was time for someone else to come in and move people over to the framework, which Mike Amlan has done a great job of. But what's your take on that? Like, do you feel that that's going to be a challenge for them, or?
Do you know? I think, personally, I think it's the wrong question to ask because what a developer uses to extend a platform. As a developer, you choose a high velocity career, right?
Yeah.
The code techniques that you or I use today are totally different from 24 months ago. Right. You mentioned it yourself. You're using Node, you're using NPM, you're using JavaScript, TypeScript, all of that stuff. Whereas 2 years ago, you might have been doing still some little bits of C# with some of that stuff.
Yeah.
It's a career path you choose. If you want to be good at your career, you're choosing by going into development. You're
keeping up with everything.
You're going into that. You'll do 8 hours in your day job, and then you'll do another 2 hours of learning what you need for tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Right. You've got to be in that mindset. You've got to be excited by the technology. You've got to be excited about pushing the boundaries. So, is Microsoft really responsible for driving a market of web devs that are, running all these hundreds of thousands of startups doing these little mobile apps that they've got this use case for? Are they trying to transition those into the Office 365 platform? It's probably the wrong target market. Are we trying to onboard and just allow the people to quickly learn how to do their day job again in the new technology? I think for me, if I was king for the day, I'd get Microsoft to help onboard the existing developers in the ecosystem quickly to a technology stack that, quite frankly, they're kind of baffled by.
Right.
I was involved in the first Dev Kitchen over a year ago now when we were introduced to the fact that the SharePoint framework was going to be NPM-based, Node-based,
No Visual Studio.
Yeah, Visual Studio Code.
Right.
I'm not going to lie, I was one of those people in the room that sat there and thought VS Code was purely for Mac developers. I said, can I install this on Windows?
Yeah, right. This runs on Windows?
Yeah, this runs on Windows? I had no idea.
Yeah.
We're as older SharePoint devs, we're being driven to adopt a whole set of things that outside of SharePoint are the norm.
So I guess the read is that it's a career advantage for developers that, they don't have to jump to it. They can continue with ADIM model.
Yeah.
But it's like a good kind of push in the right direction to make them more, I guess, competitive in other development landscapes out there as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge employment shortage, if you like, in terms of the available resources that you can employ to kind of work for you. Certainly in the UK, the London market, there's a lot of more job openings than there are people to fill them at skills. I mean, personally, we've at ADIM 365, we've taken the approach of taking on apprentices, so 18, 19-year-old.
And then training them.
Yeah, straight out of sort of school and college, training them up, taking them on the first steps of their career. And of course, they're not jaded by the history of SharePoint development. They're just keen to sort of get into the modern technologies and learn those things. So, we've been trying to help generate those new opportunities for school leavers, not just the people that have got 10 years experience in doing those things, because they both bring a good mix to the organisation as you know, as we build our products.
I think it's going to be interesting. Like, I remember when SPFX first getting talked about when I was there internally with, you know, Vesa, who was very much a .NET guy through and through, who helps, he runs the Office PMP stuff. And when everything was kind of going JavaScript, like seeing his journey through it and how he was learning all these things, it'd be interesting to chat to him this week actually on, you know, like what he's done to learn it and how we could probably prescribe that learning onto other people. I know Waldeck has been doing a similar thing, and Waldeck Mastercards, and Andrew Connell did that with Angular. Like, he did a lot of blogging over the last 2 or 3 years with the ADDIE model and kind of running Angular in that space. So I think, you know, that kind of content is definitely well needed at the moment, of this understanding. And I know Andrew Connell has a great course that he just shipped yesterday, which is like a foundational thing of like understanding
just the basics.
What you need to install. Like Bill Baer, who's been in the SharePoint marketing team for a long time, blogged yesterday about here's how to get SharePoint framework running on your Mac machine. And it wasn't, you know, next click run. It was quite a few different things you actually install to get it all up and running. So there's a lot of fundamentals you need to know. And between Bill's blog, Andrew Connell's course, which I'd highly recommend if you are trying to get into this from a developer perspective, are definitely going to help, I guess, for that jump over into that world.
I mean, there was a time between public preview and GA where Waldeck was the source of all documentation, right? He was doing the MS job for him.
I think he'd been employed. I'm like, are you on the back run here? Like, I know we've had you on a few contracts in the past, but suddenly you're the docs writer for SPFX.
Yeah, and it is an interesting kind of moving target for a developer to try and learn. And you mentioned Angular, you know, so we had 3 years of Angular being the framework of choice, and we arrive in SPFX, and Angular is the long lost child that no one wants to talk about, and React is the shiny new magpie that everyone's getting excited about. And that in of itself is kind of problematic, because if you've had those existing Office 365 devs that have gone on that journey of, I'm now out of C#, I'm now in Angular, and I'm now in a happy JavaScript place, and suddenly we're kind of getting left.
Which React is a little bit left of field of how Angular is in a way as well, right?
Well, it's just, I mean, for me, it's just the unbalance of, there's a lot more examples about how to do things in the React space. You know, there's a Office Fabric UI, I understand why it's been done in React, you know, it's supporting their own build. But there's no Angular equivalent. It's a community project that is the Angular equivalent that AC runs. And then you've got, you know, most of the big examples are done in React first, and then you have to kind of, as an Angular dev, you're now looking at disassembling the React implementation to learn how to do it in SPFX.
And as someone who was on the other side of the fence, you know, not that long ago, deciding on building mobile apps, do we do it in Xamarin, do we do it in Cordova, or do we ship them native? And Todd Baginski and we did one project where we did all of them, and you know, then we're looking at the metrics on who's pulling down what repo, like what's the most popular, because you can't keep producing these things in every single framework. And I'm guessing they're having the same problem where they're having to make a bet that we'll do everything in React, and someone will pick up the Angular stuff like Andrew, and there's a bunch of people I know on that open source project that are helping with that.
Yeah, and it's fine, right? Because you should take the step to learn enough about React that you can disassemble it and put it into your Angular app.
Right.
But you know, it is that, well, you want this community that this is where the community grumbles. It's like, you took us down this track, and then you take us 90 degrees the next time you release a new framework. You take us 90 degrees after that. We're constantly zigzagging.
This is the last one, apparently. I wouldn't bet my mortgage on it.
No, I bet the farm on that one. I don't think.
Bet the farm, I like it.
So it'll be interesting to see. But all of that aside, you know, there's still a lot of services in Office 365. You know, back to the kind of using 365 topic, that simply aren't extensible, and you've got to understand where they fit and how you're going to use them. You know, Sway. I saw some interesting comments about, you know, Sway's not used in any organisations, that particular person.
Right. Yeah.
I've got organisations using Sway heavily.
Yeah.
Right. And they're using it in newslettering, and
right.
I know it's massive in education.
In ED, that's where they're targeting it.
Yeah. So your customer base is always going to determine your viewport of the world and how.
I think it's just going to be interesting, the transition points they're going to have to make with the amount of products that are out there and where they fit, and whether they get merged. I think the most obvious one right now is Yammer. Like, where is that going to be in a year? I think that's the biggest one that really doesn't have a stake in the ground that is that obvious as an area that it just owns and totally dominates in. And so I think that'll be interesting to see how they integrate with other areas and how that's driven for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me the most exciting part of Office 365 from a dev stack is not actually the SharePoint framework, but Microsoft Graph.
Yep.
I mean, I've been fortunate enough to use the Graph pre-release, way back when it was still a beta. Put some pioneering customers live with the beta. They understood their risk profile of maybe breaking changes to the API. But that idea of one API that services the whole stack, that you can actually build a business use case scenario that around, well, I'm going to get a bit from Outlook, I'm going to get a bit from SharePoint, I'm going to get another bit from OneDrive, kind of dovetail those into the experience that my employee needs through one API. I mean, that for me is one of Microsoft's most important.
You kind of beat me to my final question, which is what's the bit that you're most excited about? It sounds like the Graph is where.
Yeah, the Graph. I mean, it's trickier to put Graph components into a SharePoint page than I'd like it to be.
Yep.
But that's not the Graph's fault. That's SharePoint not using the same auth model.
Yep.
But the use cases that we've been able to build based on Graph, there's probably 70% of our product suite is Graph connected, and that means that we're really taking that value from all those different services that Graph exposes and presenting it into an interface that the employee has no idea. The employee doesn't know that the data came from this particular service. They've got that experience, and for me that was groundbreaking and a huge opportunity for our business to do some really innovative things, because this one API, once I've connected to it, I can get all that different sort of data and do that across different devices as well. So you're not limited to just web.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because technically with the Graph, it means any new presentation could technically win and be like that, the central home that you go to as an Office 365 user to start your morning. And I think right now there's definitely some competition internally in Microsoft, for good or bad, where Teams want to be that landing page, and SharePoint definitely want to be that landing page, and the Outlook team want to also be like that landing page. And I guess for a long time, Outlook has definitely owned that. If you went and spoke to anyone in the ecosystem of Office 365, the majority of them would say they use Outlook the most. It'll be interesting in the next 2 years whether that changes or not. Like, I know at Hyperfish, if you ask the guys out there, they'd probably say Slack. We barely do any email unless it's external, and everything is done via Slack. So I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for maybe smaller organizations that maybe the majority don't work externally with, that Slack or an equivalent like Microsoft Teams would be more than enough to do their day job without having, maybe there'll be emails for certain formalities, but not on a day-to-day aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same thing. Remember a few years ago, working for a different organisation, I'd introduce them to a Yammer as their intranet.
Right.
And they're running their entire organisation via a Yammer network. And that was the right thing at the right time. Today that wouldn't be your choice. You wouldn't say, well, okay, you'd pick it up, and like you say, you'd use Teams because it's more fully fledged and it's got the tabbing and the bot.
Isn't that crazy that we're saying that and it's only V1 GA'd a few weeks ago? Like, I think that's definitely testament to that Microsoft team that have put that together, that people are already considering it. I mean, I know there's some bloggers out there that have been pretty horrific to it in terms of, it's nowhere near Slack. There's features that are missing, external users and bits and private channels, but it's nowhere near as, it's not the Windows Phone of high velocity chat apps, that's for sure. Being very blunt.
It's the only time you see a Windows Phone, when you fly here.
You're
sitting on the phone. Sitting on the phones, like, you've got a Nokia.
Usually it's the children of Microsoft people, because even the Microsoft employees flip their phone and hand it onto their kids. But that's the general way. So keep looking at the Graph. Keep your eye to the ground on SharePoint Framework if you're a developer. And then definitely explore some of the collaboration spaces that are creeping up around groups and Microsoft Teams and so forth.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. I appreciate your time, mate.
No worries.
Thank you. And it's good to hear a Brit, a fellow Brit. Not that I really associate myself as a Brit anymore. I'm kind of like quasi everything now.
Yeah,
But it's good to have you in town, and thanks for popping by the offices.
No problem.
Cheers, Wes.
Thanks, mate.